They asked me what I feared most in the war. Not the plasma cannons. Not the void mines that could swallow a cruiser whole. Not the devourer fleets that ate entire star systems for fuel. I told them, humans. The room went quiet. 7 generals. 3 admirals. 1 supreme warlord of the collective, a being who had watched civilizations burn like candles and felt nothing. They all looked at me the way you look at something that has lost its mind. I had not lost my mind. I had, in fact, finally found it. I had found on a broken planet called Earth 7, in a trench filled with mud and blood and things I still cannot name, watching a human soldier drag 3 of my wounded soldiers to safety, soldiers who had been trying to kill her 40 seconds earlier. She didn't do it because she was ordered to. She did it because they were hurt. That was the day I understood. That was the day I stopped calling them primitive. That was the day I started being afraid, not of what they could destroy, but of what they were willing to survive. This is my confession. All of it. The parts my government buried, the parts my commanders called classified, the parts that will probably get me executed for saying out loud. Every word is true. You were never supposed to know any of it. My name is Vorith Sel, and I am the last surviving commander of the 7th Collective Armada. That title sounds powerful. It is not. There is no 7th Collective Armada anymore. There are pieces of it scattered across 4-star systems like broken teeth, rusting in the dark between planets where no one goes and nothing lives. I am the last one standing, not because I was the strongest or the smartest. I am the last one standing because I was the only one who learned to think like them before it was too late. The humans. We did not call them that at first. The collective had many names for them. Lesser biologicals, expendables, carbon primitives. My personal favorite, used by Admiral Drethkar before he died screaming on the bridge of his own flagship, was mud crawlers. He said it with such contempt. He said it at a press conference broadcast across 47 star systems, 2 weeks before the Battle of Proxima Station. 2 weeks before a single human battalion, 412 soldiers running on no sleep and something they called energy drinks, held a space station against 11,000 collective troops for 9 days. 9 days. We were supposed to take the station in 6 hours. I remember sitting in the command bay of the Venerath, our fleet carrier, watching the battle report scroll in and feeling something I had never felt before in 42 years of military service. It was not respect. Not yet. What I felt was confusion. Pure, deep, structurally destabilizing confusion, because the numbers did not make sense. The numbers had never made sense since the moment we made contact with the human species, and I had spent 3 years telling myself it was data error. It was not data error. Let me go back to the beginning. Let me tell you what we knew about humans before we decided to conquer them, and then let me tell you how catastrophically, embarrassingly wrong all of it was. The collective is old, older than most species can comprehend. We have been spacefaring for 8,000 years. We have conquered or absorbed over 200 civilizations. We have a process for it, a clean, efficient, well-practiced process. First, we send probes. The probes map the target civilization, assess its technology level, its military capacity, its social structure, its will to resist. Then, we classify the civilization on the collective's dominant scale, which runs from Class 1, meaning no meaningful resistance possible, up to Class 9, meaning full-scale war engagement required. The highest class rating we had ever given to any species we successfully conquered was Class 6. The Thervani, a species of 4-armed insectoids with hive mind coordination and psionic artillery, rated Class 6. It took us 40 years and our largest armada to bring them into the collective. We rated humanity Class 3. Class 3. I want you to understand what that means. Class 3 means a civilization with basic space travel, rudimentary energy weapons, no experience in interstellar warfare, no significant military coordination above a planetary level, and a biological form that is, by collective standards, fragile. 2 arms, 2 legs, no exoskeleton, no natural venom, no regenerative capacity, bone structure that shatters under moderate impact, soft tissue that tears, a lifespan that, compared to most spacefaring species, is almost insultingly short. The probes came back. The analysts looked at the data. Someone in the intelligence division wrote, in an official report that I have memorized word for word because I read it 1,000 times trying to understand how he got it so wrong, the following sentence: humanity presents no meaningful threat to collective expansion. Recommends standard class 3 pacification protocol. Estimated timeline for full absorption, 18 months. 18 months. We are now in year 11 of the human wars. I do not blame the analysts entirely. The data was what it was. Humans, observed from a distance, look exactly like what we thought they were. They are small. Their technology, circa first contact, was genuinely primitive by interstellar standards. Their weapons, compared to collective standard armaments, were toys. Their military vehicles were slow. Their communication systems were easily jammed. Their biology, on paper, is a list of vulnerabilities. The problem, and I cannot stress this enough, is that none of that matters. None of it matters because of something the probes could not measure. Something that does not show up on any standard assessment. Something that in 8,000 years of expansion, the collective had never encountered in sufficient quantity to flag as a military variable. Human stubbornness. Not stubbornness in the ordinary sense. Every species resists to some degree. Every species has soldiers who will fight past the point of rational self-preservation. That is normal. That is expected and factored into standard projections. What humans have is something else. Something that operates at a species level, not an individual level. Something that seems to get stronger, not weaker, the more you damage them. We learned this in the first engagement. The first landing on Earth Prime, which the collective's history books, if the collective still has history books, which I doubt, call the easy pacification. 40 warships, ground troops numbering in the hundreds of thousands. We targeted their largest continent, their densest population center, their primary military installations. Standard procedure. Overwhelming force to break resistance before it could organize. The whole thing was supposed to take 2 weeks. The resistance organized in 8 hours. Not through their military command structure, which we had effectively dismantled in the first bombardment. Not through any centralized leadership, which we had targeted specifically. It organized through what humans call, and I had to have this translated 3 times before I believed it, social media. Ordinary citizens, with no military training, used personal communication devices to coordinate. They shared maps of our troop positions. They shared improvised weapon designs. They shared information about which areas were still safe and which were not. They formed supply chains. They organized medical care. They did all of this while we were still congratulating ourselves on taking out their command centers, completely unaware that humans do not need command centers the way we do. They do not need someone to tell them to resist. They just do it. By the end of the first week, we had taken 40% of the target continent and lost 22% of our ground forces. We had expected to lose maybe 3%. The casualty projections were so far off from reality that the officers on the ground assumed there was a malfunction in the reporting system. They ran diagnostics. Everything was working fine. The numbers were just real. I was not on Earth Prime for the first landing. I was on Venerath, 3 systems away, watching the reports come in with the same disbelief everyone else felt. My commanding officer at the time, a 4-star general named Krethvorl, watched the casualty numbers tick upward for 2 days before he said something I will never forget. He said, "They're dying faster than they're giving up. This is a calculation error. Beings do not do this." Krethvorl died on Earth Prime 6 months later, in the ground campaign, when a group of human civilians, not soldiers, civilians, ambushed his command convoy using weapons they had built from parts of vehicles we had destroyed. He survived the ambush. He did not survive what came after, when he ordered the surrounding village burned and the humans in the next village, who had no connection to the ambush, came for him anyway. I am not telling this story to make humans sound like monsters. I am telling it because that response, that immediate, personal, collectively enforced response to harm, is something the collective had no framework for. When we harm a civilian population to punish a military action, we create fear. Fear reduces resistance. Every species we had ever encountered responded this way. It is basic. It is logical. It works. It does not work on humans. When we harm a human civilian population to punish a military action, we do not create fear. We create soldiers, ordinary people who yesterday were doing whatever ordinary humans do, and I have studied them enough to know it involves a baffling variety of activities, from growing food to making music to watching recordings of other humans doing athletic things, transform overnight into fighters. Not good fighters initially, but learning ones, motivated ones. And humans motivated and learning are the most dangerous variable in any tactical equation I have ever encountered. There was a human concept I came across in captured intelligence documents. A saying, What doesn't kill me makes me stronger. I passed it to our xenopsychology division and asked them to analyze it. They came back 3 weeks later and said it appeared to be a motivational phrase, possibly metaphorical, not meant to be taken literally. I sent them back to analyze it again. It is not metaphorical. It is a species-level behavioral description. The collective's war doctrine is built on a principle called escalation dominance. The idea is simple. You always have more force available than your enemy. You make that clear early. The enemy calculates the cost of continued resistance, finds it unacceptable, and surrenders. Clean, efficient. It works because every rational species, at some point, performs a survival calculation and chooses survival. Humans perform the calculation differently. A human in an impossible situation does not calculate the probability of survival. A human in an impossible situation calculates the cost of not fighting. And that cost, the psychological, moral, social cost of surrender, is something we never factored in because we did not know it existed. We did not know a species could be structurally built to find surrender more painful than death. I know how this sounds. I'm aware of how this sounds. I spent 3 years insisting it was an error, a fluke, a matter of us not yet applying sufficient force. I was wrong. I was wrong the way you are wrong when you have a complete and total framework for understanding the universe, and reality keeps violating it, and you keep trying to fix reality instead of your framework. The first time I understood, really understood, in my body, not just my mind, was at Kepler Station. Kepler Station was a human mining installation on the edge of their home system. Small, practically no military value. We took it in the 3rd month of the war as a supply depot. 40 human workers had been there when we arrived. They surrendered without a fight. We processed them as non-combatants, moved them to a holding area, and got on with using their station. 6 weeks later, those 40 humans had taken back half the station. 40 non-combatant miners. They had been watching our soldiers for 6 weeks, memorizing patrol patterns, learning our equipment by observation, identifying structural weaknesses in the station design that they knew because they had built the station. They waited until the precise moment when a shift rotation left a specific corridor undermanned, and then they moved. They used mining tools. They used pipes. They used their hands. They took back half the station and held it for 11 days before reinforcements arrived. When we eventually retook the station, we found, carved into the wall of the section they had held, a list of 40 names. Every one of them, like they were signing their work, like they wanted us to know who had done this. I stood in that corridor for a long time. I kept thinking about those 40 people, what they must have felt in those 6 weeks, the patience, the discipline, the collective decision to not show anything, to keep surrendering on the surface while building resistance underneath. The planning, the coordination without any of the tools we assumed coordination required. And then the decision, unanimous, apparently, because our intelligence found no evidence of a leader, to move. They chose a moment when they had a chance, not a guarantee. They did not wait for a guarantee. Humans, I was beginning to understand, do not wait for guarantees. I filed a report when I left Kepler Station. I wrote that we had fundamentally misclassified humanity. I wrote that the Class 3 rating was not just wrong, but dangerous, that continuing to operate on that framework would cost us the war. I recommended a full strategic review. I recommended halting offensive operations until we had a better understanding of what we were actually dealing with. The report was filed, reviewed, and quietly archived by 3 separate senior commanders who were not ready to tell the collective that an 18-month pacification operation was turning into something else entirely. Because the collective does not lose. That is the other thing you need to understand. The collective does not lose. In 8,000 years, we had never lost a war of conquest. Never. The doctrine, the culture, the identity of the collective is built on that fact. Admitting that humanity was something we had misjudged was not merely a tactical adjustment. It was an existential threat to the story the collective told about itself. So instead of adjusting the strategy, they sent more ships, more troops, more force against humans. I cannot describe to you, even now, how deeply that misunderstood the situation. Sending more force against humans is not like turning up the heat until something melts. Sending more force against humans is like throwing wood on a fire and calling it firefighting. The more we sent, the more of them there were. Not biologically, not breeding, though I will get to human biology and reproduction later because that is its own category of horrifying. I mean socially, psychologically. Every escalation we made brought more humans into the fight who had previously been on the edges. Civilians who had been waiting to see if the war would reach them. Communities that had been focused on their own survival. Factions that had been fighting each other before we arrived and who, the moment we showed up, stopped. This is the thing that broke our war theorists. Humans were fighting each other, fiercely, bitterly, with the full passionate commitment they bring to everything, right up until we invaded. And then they stopped. Different nations, different cultures, different languages, different ideologies. Ancient grudges. Recent wars. Deep, structural hatreds that our intelligence division had assumed would fracture any unified resistance before it could form. They stopped. Not all of them. Not perfectly, not without friction. But enough. Enough to coordinate. Enough to share resources. Enough to point their collective energy outward instead of inward. One of our senior analysts, Dr. Vreth Sewell, who spent 30 years studying primitive civilizations, submitted an assessment that said, and I am paraphrasing because the original is classified in a vault somewhere, that humanity appeared to require an external threat to suppress its internal conflicts, and that we had, in invading, accidentally provided the one thing most likely to unify them against us. We had given them a common enemy. That enemy was us. Dr. Vreth Sewell was reassigned to a non-combat advisory role, and her assessment was buried. She was correct. She was completely and entirely correct, and she was punished for being correct because the alternative, accepting that we had made the situation worse by escalating, was not something the command structure could absorb. That is when I started keeping my own records. Private ones. Unofficial ones. Notes on what I was seeing that the official reports were not capturing in the gap between what the collective told itself about the war and what the war actually was. I have those notes. I have them here. I have carried them for 11 years across 17 star systems, through 2 fleet destructions and 1 court-martial that did not stick. Everything I'm telling you is in those notes. Everything I'm telling you is true, and I'm only just getting started. By the end of year 2, the collective had deployed more military assets against humanity than against any civilization in our history. That includes the Thurvani. That includes the Dorith Armada, which was a spacefaring empire, not a single-planet species. That includes the Kareth, who had psionic weapons capable of disabling the higher cognitive functions of anyone within a 5-kilometer radius. More ships, more troops, more orbital bombardment platforms than the engineering division had ever been asked to produce in a 2-year span. The factories on 6 collective core worlds were running triple shifts, which is not a thing that happens, which is something that had never happened in the modern era of the collective. Against one planet, one species, one class 3. I want to be very precise here because I think precision is the only thing standing between this account and the kind of story that sounds like exaggeration. Humanity, in year 2 of the war, had not developed faster than light travel. They were still using chemical propulsion for the bulk of their fleet, rockets, essentially the same technology they had been using since they first left their atmosphere. Their energy weapons were functional but primitive. Their ships were slower than ours, less armored than ours, with shorter range and worse sensors. In a direct, ship-to-ship engagement in open space, a collective warship would defeat a comparable human vessel most of the time. The word most is doing a lot of work in that sentence, because humans did not fight us in open space. Humans, and this took our tactical division an embarrassingly long time to understand, do not fight the battle the opponent wants to fight. They fight the battle they can win. And if they cannot find a battle they can win, they do something extraordinary. They create one. The human military had a word for it. Asymmetric warfare. The collective xenolinguistics team translated it as uneven conflict tactics, which is technically accurate and completely misses the point. Asymmetric warfare, as humans practice it, is not a fallback strategy for a weaker opponent. It is a deliberate philosophical approach to conflict that assumes the opponent is stronger, studies that strength until its weaknesses are visible, and then attacks specifically and only those weaknesses, refusing all other engagements. It sounds simple. It is catastrophically effective. The engagement at Varen Belt, what the collective records call the Varen disaster, in the rare cases where the records acknowledge it at all, was the moment I truly stopped sleeping. Not from exhaustion, though there was plenty of that. from a sustained, low-frequency horror of understanding what we were dealing with. Belt was a debris field in the outer edge of the Sol system. Strategically, it was almost meaningless. A shipping lane, a few monitoring stations, nothing worth fighting over in any conventional sense. We had a patrol fleet there, 12 ships, rotating schedule, because we had patrol fleets everywhere because the collective's doctrine called for territorial control. The humans studied that patrol fleet for 4 months. 4 months of intelligence collection. They sent small, slow, barely detectable probes. Nothing our sensors were calibrated to flag as threatening, because they were not threatening individually. They sent them constantly, dozens of them, each one collecting a small piece of data. Patrol timing, sensor coverage gaps, communication windows, the specific models of ships, and therefore their known blind spots. They collected all of it and built, in secret, on a planet 6 billion kilometers away, a response. Not a fleet. They cannot match our fleet. They built mines. Not sophisticated mines. Mines made from repurposed industrial equipment and leftover chemical propellant and sheer, grinding, patient ingenuity. They deployed them over a period of 3 weeks, moving them in so slowly and in such small increments that they registered as debris drift, background noise in a debris field. They were, from a technological standpoint, almost embarrassingly primitive. They destroyed 9 of our 12 ships. Not because the mines were powerful enough to destroy a collective warship in a single detonation. They were not. They destroyed 9 ships because the mine placement was precise enough, and the simultaneous detonation was timed carefully enough to create a chain of events. Hull breaches in specific locations, secondary explosions from specific systems, communication disruption at a specific moment, that the 3 surviving ships could not respond to effectively. By the time the surviving ships understood what was happening, 6 of the destroyed ships had already vented atmosphere. The other 3 went up when the humans remotely detonated additional charges they had built into the debris surrounding the field, charges our sensors had seen and classified as, again, debris. 460 collective soldiers, dead in 14 minutes. The human cost of the operation was 3 lives, the crew of the small ship that delivered the final remote detonation charges, and did not get clear in time. 3 human lives versus 460 collective soldiers in a strategically meaningless debris field, using technology that would have made a collective engineer laugh if they had seen it on a blueprint. No collective engineer was laughing afterward. I read the after-action report. I read it, and then I sat with it for 6 hours, and then I read it again. What I kept coming back to was the 4 months. The patience. The willingness to spend 4 months doing nothing visible. No attacks, no gestures, no resistance, while collecting information and building a trap. The collective's intelligence models had interpreted the absence of visible activity in Belt as acceptance. Submission. We had looked at 4 months of quiet and seen compliance. We had been watching them build the weapon that killed us. This was the human understanding of time that destroyed us, over and over again in 100 different configurations for 11 years. Humans think about time differently than almost any spacefaring species I have encountered. They have a capacity for deferred action, for waiting, building, preparing, without any of the behavioral signals that other species exhibit when they're planning aggression. That borders on something I can only describe as geological. They are patient the way rock is patient. Not because they are slow, because they have decided that the right moment has not yet arrived, and they will simply wait until it does, doing everything necessary to be ready, showing nothing. The collective's intelligence apparatus was built to detect species that behave the way most species behave when they are planning resistance. Species that move troops. Species that increase communication. Species that show visible military activity. Species that get louder. Humans get quieter. When humans get quiet, they're coming for you. It took us almost 3 years to learn that. Almost 3 years and several thousand dead, and the Varen disaster, and 6 other engagements that followed the same pattern in different configurations before our intelligence division updated its models to flag human silence as a threat indicator rather than a compliance indicator. By then, the humans had used the same basic approach enough times that they were teaching it to each other, civilians, not just military. There are captured human documents from this period that our translation teams spent months working through, practical guides to sabotage and resistance tactics distributed openly across their communication networks. Written in plain language, updated regularly based on what was working and what was not. They were writing real-time tactical manuals, publishing them, giving them away. The collective had classified tactical information for thousands of years as a matter of military doctrine. The idea that you would distribute your tactics openly, that you would show your hand to your enemy in the process of showing it to everyone else, was inconceivable. Our analysts were convinced it was a deception, that the published manuals were misinformation designed to lead us toward wrong conclusions. Some of it was. Some of it was deliberate misinformation, and it worked, and we embarrassed ourselves following the false leads. But most of it was exactly what it appeared to be, real tactics, freely shared, with the explicit understanding that if enough people knew how to resist, it did not matter if the enemy also knew, because there were simply too many people applying the knowledge for the enemy to stop all of them. This is the thing about humans that I still struggle to explain to collective audiences, because it requires a complete rethinking of how you understand military power. The collective thinks about military power the way you think about a very large, very sharp weapon. You have it. The enemy does not. You use it. They cannot stop it. That is power. Humans think about military power the way they think about water. You cannot stop water by attacking it directly. Water finds every crack. Water distributes itself around obstacles. Water, in sufficient quantity, does not need to be sharp or fast or disciplined. It just has to be everywhere. And the way humans make water everywhere is by ensuring that the knowledge of resistance, the tools of resistance, the culture of resistance are spread so widely and so deeply that there's no single point of failure. Kill the general. Another appears. Destroy the factory. They build two more, smaller ones, harder to find. Jam the communications. They switch to methods that cannot be jammed. Runners, signals, a system they revived from ancient history that uses mirrors and light. We jammed their signals. They used mirrors. I'm not making that up. In the campaign on Earth 7, in the third year, when we blanketed the northern continent with a communications disruption field so complete that electronic transmission was impossible, the human resistance went back to a signaling system that their ancestors had used before electricity. Mirrors and sunlight. Simple géométrique pattern encoding simple message. Completely invisible to every piece of sophisticated monitoring equipment we had, because sophisticated monitoring equipment was not looking for mirrors. We had to recalibrate everything, while they were figuring out other things. The human capacity for improvisation, real, functional, effective improvisation under extreme pressure, is something I watched with something that kept threatening to become admiration before I strangled it back down. They would take our technology, captured or salvaged or stolen, and adapt it. Sometimes they adapted it in ways that made sense and should have been obvious. Sometimes they adapted it in ways that should not have worked and worked anyway. There was a unit in the southern territories of Earth 3, a region with no formal military training, a population that had been primarily agricultural before the war, who figured out how to modify collective communication arrays to broadcast disruption signals that interfered with our ship navigation systems. They had no engineering degrees. They had the arrays, and they had time, and they had the kind of desperate intelligence that seems to activate in humans when everything is on the line. They brought down 4 supply ships. Agricultural workers. For supply ships. I started a file around this time. Separate from my official reports, separate from my private notes. Just a list. A record of human actions that should not have been possible and were. Not the large, famous engagements. Those are being documented by everyone. I mean the small ones. The individual stories. The 40 miners at Kepler Station. The mirror signal network. The agricultural engineers and the navigation disruption. A teenager, captured intelligence said, who figured out how to access and corrupt collective supply manifests using a device meant for personal entertainment, a gaming machine. He did not stop there. He taught 11 other people how to do it. They corrupted 17 months of supply chain data before we found the breach. A child with a game machine. 17 months. I kept the list because the command structure did not want to hear it, and because I could feel in a way I could not articulate that the list was the real war. Not the fleet engagements. Not the planetary bombardment campaigns. The list. The people who should have given up and did not. The people who had no weapons and made weapons. The people who had no training and trained each other. The people who looked at a collective surveillance system and found the gap in its coverage and met there in that gap to plan. The humans were finding every gap. There was a collective strategic doctrine developed in the war's fourth year. It was called total environmental denial. The idea was that we had been making a tactical error by engaging with human resistance directly, that every engagement, even victories, provided humans with information they used to improve. Total environmental denial proposed cutting that loop. Instead of engaging with the resistance, we would deny it resources: food, water, energy, medicine. If humans could not sustain themselves biologically, resistance would be impossible. It was, from a purely logical standpoint, a reasonable doctrine. From a human standpoint, it was fuel. The implementation of total environmental denial in the Beta territories, 3 continents we had controlled long enough that the human population had theoretically been pacified, created what became known in human records as the Winter of Steel. I have read those records. I have read human accounts of what they endured during that period, and I want to be very clear about something. It was terrible. It was genuinely, horrifically terrible. Humans suffered enormously. The collective committed what I will call, using honest language, atrocities. The resistance in the Beta territories did not collapse. It tripled, because humans starving and freezing and dying of the diseases that come with deprivation made a collective decision that the collective was trying to understand and could not, that dying while fighting was preferable to dying while passive, that if the end was the same regardless, they chose the version with agency. They chose to spend whatever time remained doing something, and that something, uniformly and without any central command directing it, was hurting us. People who could barely walk were sabotaging supply lines. Dying people were passing information. Individuals who would not survive the winter were spending their last functional weeks making sure that whoever came after them had everything they had learned. They were leaving notes, literal handwritten notes, tucked into walls and buried in specific locations about patrol patterns and equipment weaknesses and what worked and what had not, written for people they would never meet who would find the notes in spring after the writers were dead. They were writing letters to a future they would not live to see. I read some of those notes. The translation teams gave me access. Most of them were practical, tactical information, nothing personal. But some of them were not. Some of them were addressed to no one in particular, and they were not tactical at all. They said things like, "We were here, and we did not stop." They said, "Whoever finds this, keep going." They said in several cases, nothing except a name. Just a name. Someone writing their own name into a wall so that the world would know they had existed and had not given up. I am a soldier. I have been a soldier for 42 years. I have fought in 11 wars before the human wars. I have won most of them. I have killed a great many people of many species in the performance of my duty to the collective, and I will not pretend that I lost sleep over all of them. I lost sleep over those notes, because they changed the shape of the war in my mind. The collective thought of the human wars as a military problem, a logistics problem, a force versus force calculation that would resolve in our favor when we applied sufficient force. The notes told me it was something else. It was a question of what a species was willing to endure. And the answer that those notes written by dying people in a winter we had engineered gave me, was that there was no number. There was no amount. We had not found the bottom of what humans would endure in order to continue, and I was beginning to suspect there was no bottom. That was when I finally understood why we were going to lose. Not because humans had better ships. They did not. Not because humans had better weapons. They did not. Not because they were strategically superior. In formal, structured, conventional warfare, they were not. We were going to lose because you cannot win a war of attrition against a species that has decided at a level below strategy, below doctrine, below calculation, that stopping is not an option. You can hurt them. You can hurt them badly. You can hurt them in ways that would break any other species we had ever encountered. You cannot make them stop. And a war against an opponent that will not stop, when you are expending enormous resources and still not stopping them, has only one ending. Eventually, you stop. I wrote this in a report. I submitted the report to Fleet Command. I recommended immediate ceasefire negotiations. I argued that humanity would negotiate, that despite everything, they were a species that also pursued peace, that within their history there were examples of successful conflict resolution, that they were not a species committed to our total destruction, and would accept terms that gave them sovereignty and security. I was relieved of command. But I was not wrong. I was not wrong. And the proof of that is where we are now, 11 years in, With every armada, we committed broken or retreating, with 3 collective core worlds redirecting resources from civilian infrastructure to military production, and still falling short. With our most senior generals using words in private communication that they would never use publicly, words like unwinnable and miscalculation, and one phrase in a message from Supreme Warlord Deather himself that I will never forget as long as I live. What have we done? 3 words. No question mark. Not a question. A recognition. What have we done? What we had done was go to war with the one species in the known galaxy that had spent its entire history, millions of years of evolution, adapting to survive everything that had ever tried to kill it. Diseases, ice ages, predators, each other, catastrophic environmental collapse, extinction-level events that had ended a dozen other species that shared their planet at various points and had not ended them. Every single thing that had ever tried to kill humanity had failed. And after millions of years of that, after millions of years of being the creature that keeps surviving things that should not be survivable, they had built something into themselves that was not in any database we had. The absolute, cellular, bone-deep belief that they would make it. Not hope, not optimism, not denial. Something harder and quieter than any of those things. The belief that this thing, whatever it is, will not be the thing that ends us. Because nothing else has been. We were not fighting an army. We were fighting an entire species that had already survived everything. We just did not know that yet. There is a human word. Morale. The collective has an equivalent concept, something that translates roughly as unit cohesion or combat willingness. It is a factor in our planning. It is something we monitor, something we try to maintain in our own forces, something we try to damage in enemy forces. Standard military consideration. It ranks below logistics, below strategic positioning, below technological capability. It is a variable, not a constant. Humans build wars out of morale the way other species build wars out of metal. I did not understand this for a long time. I understood it on paper before I understood it in practice. On paper, I knew that human psychological resilience was anomalously high. The research was there. The engagement data was there. But knowing a thing on paper and seeing it with your own eyes, hearing it with your own auditory organs, having it rearrange something fundamental in how you understand the universe. These are different experiences. The moment of true understanding for me was not a battle. It was a song. Year 5 of the war. I was part of a senior command observation team sent to Earth 4, one of the colony worlds, to assess conditions in a region we had theoretically pacified 18 months earlier. The assessment was supposed to be routine, a confirmation that the pacification had held, that the population was compliant, that the occupation was stable. Standard review. The region was not stable. It was quiet. In that way, I had learned to dread the human quiet that meant something was growing underneath the surface. But that is not what I want to tell you about. What I want to tell you about happened on the 3rd day in a small settlement on the edge of the controlled zone, which our records classified as a compliant population, no significant resistance indicators. We arrived at the settlement at what our timing system registered as mid-afternoon. There were approximately 300 humans there, farmers, mostly, with some workers from a mining operation nearby. No military personnel, no visible weapons, nothing that triggered our threat protocols. Our translator was running. We were observing. From somewhere in the middle of the settlement, someone started singing. I do not know the song. I have tried, since, to identify it from recordings. I have not been able to. It may have been something local, something regional, something that only existed in that settlement, and that I will never be able to track down in any database. What I can tell you is that within 30 seconds, other voices joined it. Within 2 minutes, nearly the entire settlement was singing. 300 people, in the middle of an occupied territory, in the middle of a war they were visibly and measurably losing, singing together. Our threat protocols flagged it as a potential signal communication. We ran analysis. It was not a signal. It was just singing. The soldier beside me, a young officer named Vrethsul Jr., yes, the daughter of the analyst who had been reassigned, she had specifically requested to serve under me, said very quietly, "What are they doing?" I did not have an answer. Not then. I watched those 300 humans sing, watched them look at each other while they sang, watched something happen in the way they stood and held their heads, something that shifted from the posture of occupied people to the posture of something else, something that did not have a word in the collective's language. Later, I understood what I'd seen. They were reminding themselves who they were. That is what the song was doing. Not communicating tactics. not signaling, not defying us, not directly, not in any way we could reasonably classify as a security threat. They were reminding 300 people that they had a shared identity that predated our arrival and would outlast our occupation, that they were something together that was not about us at all, that we could control their food supply and their movement and their communication channels, and we could not touch this. This was theirs, and it existed entirely outside our reach. I filed a report. I noted that morale in the settlement was substantially higher than pre-visit intelligence had indicated. I recommended increased cultural suppression protocols. The recommendation was implemented. They were forbidden from gathering in groups larger than 20. They were forbidden from public music. They sang alone, then, quietly, so our monitoring equipment would not catch it. They sang in their homes, and they sang to their children, and the children grew up knowing the songs and knowing why they sang them quietly, which is a different thing from not knowing. You cannot cut the root. That is what I kept writing in my private notes. Every cultural suppression protocol we implemented was cutting leaves. We would come back in 6 months, and the leaves would be back. The root was deeper than we knew how to reach. Around the same period, I was assigned to analyze a captured human, a senior resistance coordinator who had been taken during a raid on an underground command facility. Significant intelligence value. The interrogation was handled by collective specialists, and I was observing and consulting on strategy. I will not describe the interrogation in detail. I will say only that the collective's interrogation methods are effective on most species. They were not effective on this human. Not because she was brave. She was brave, but that is not the reason. The reason is stranger and more disturbing than bravery. The reason is that at a certain point in the interrogation, she stopped engaging with what was happening to her physically, and she went somewhere else. Not unconsciousness. Something else. Our monitoring equipment showed full consciousness throughout. She was present. She simply chose, in some way I do not have the vocabulary to properly describe, to not be present in the way we needed. When she did speak, not information, never information, just words, she was calm. Genuinely calm, not performed calm. She talked about things that had nothing to do with the war. Memories. A place she had grown up. The specifics are irrelevant. What was relevant was that she was using the memories as a place to live while her body went through something her mind had apparently decided was happening to someone else. The collective's chief interrogation specialist, a being who had been extracting information from resistant subjects for 60 years, told me privately after the third session that he had never encountered this specific capacity before. He said most species, under sufficient duress, broke at the cognitive level. Their minds surrendered the information to end the experience. He said this human had found a way to prevent the experience from being the kind of thing her mind needed to respond to. He said it was the most frightening thing he had ever seen in a professional context. She died without giving us anything. I attended, which I had not planned. I'm not certain why I did. I stayed outside the room, watching through the monitoring system, and when she was gone, I sat there for a while in the corridor, doing something I had not done since I was a young soldier, which is question whether the thing I was fighting for deserved the person who had just died opposing it. I did not do anything about that question. Not then. I filed it away in the place I was filing many things in year 5, the place in my mind that I had labeled for later, and that was getting very full. I went back to my duties. I conducted the analysis. I submitted the report. But I kept seeing her face. The war changed in year 6 in a way that the collective's history, if history survives what is coming, will have to call a turning point. This is when humanity made a technological leap. Not because we underestimated their technical capacity, though we had. They made the leap because they had been for 6 years in close proximity to collective technology, capturing it, salvaging it, studying it, being killed by it, and therefore highly motivated to understand it. They had our equipment. Not enough to simply copy, but enough to learn from. And humans, given something to learn from and sufficient motivation to learn at a rate that should not be physically possible given what we understood about their cognitive architecture. Their cognitive architecture, I will note, we also dramatically underestimated. This is a pattern. The first indication of a shift was small. Captured collective communication devices that had been modified in ways our technicians classified as unusual, but non-functional. They were wrong. The modifications were functional. They were producing an effect that our technicians could not identify, because it was not an effect they had seen before, a form of signal encoding that used a principle our communications division had theorized, but never implemented because the theoretical models suggested it was too computationally expensive to be practical. A human engineer working from captured equipment and a very incomplete understanding of the underlying physics had solved the computational cost problem with an approach that our own engineers had not considered. When we eventually reverse-engineered what she had done, and yes, one person, one human engineer working in a resistance facility, our chief of technical intelligence submitted a report that said, essentially, that it should not have been possible. Not at her technology level, not with the resources available, not in the time it apparently took. He also noted that she had apparently figured it out while also doing 3 other things, because the facility had been running active resistance operations throughout the period in which the engineering development occurred. Humans do several things at once with a fluency that most species require specialization to achieve. This is not a minor point. Specialization, the development of dedicated, focused expertise in a narrow field, is how the collective and most advanced civilizations approach technical problems. You put your best minds on a single problem and let them focus. Humans do not naturally operate this way. They generalize. They cross-pollinate between fields. They make connections between disciplines that specialists, buried in their own domains, do not see. The communications breakthrough came from a human who was also running logistics for a resistance cell and also, apparently, teaching children reading in whatever time was left over. Because she was doing all 3 things, she saw a connection between an administrative problem in the logistics system and the theoretical communications model she was working on, and that connection was the solution. Specialization is efficient. Generalization is adaptable. We were fighting a war of specialization against a species of generalists. The communications breakthrough was the first domino. It enabled human resistance cells across multiple planets to coordinate in ways we could not monitor, could not jam, and could not decrypt. A reversal of the communications advantage we had held since the beginning of the war. The second domino was the propulsion modification, which came 8 months later and increased the effective speed of human vessels by a factor that brought them within range of competitive engagement with our mid-tier ships. The third domino was the weapons development, which I will not detail precisely, but which meant that by year 7, a human warship was no longer automatically at a disadvantage in a direct engagement with a comparable collective vessel. By year 7, we were fighting a Class 3 civilization that had, in 6 years of war, advanced its military technology by approximately 200 years. The Collective Scientific Advisor Corps produced a report in year 7 that I read and then immediately classified at the highest level and had locked in a vault on my flagship because if it had circulated, it would have caused what I believed would be an irreversible collapse of command morale. The report analyzed the rate of human technological advancement during the war and projected forward. It concluded that at the current acceleration rate, if the war continued another 5 years, human military technology would reach parity with the collective's most advanced systems, and that parity would be a transitional state lasting no more than 2 to 3 years before humans pulled ahead. Pulled ahead. A species that had been classified Class 3. A species we had gone to war with expecting an 18-month pacification operation. A species whose primary initial military advantage was the willingness to die for each other and the patience to wait in the dark while building things that would kill us. Pulled ahead. The report was by Dr. Erich Von, the most decorated military scientist in the collective's modern era. He had never been wrong about a projection in a 40-year career. I spoke to him privately outside the official channels in a way that was not strictly within protocol, because I needed to know if there was an error in the methodology, some variable he had not accounted for. He told me there was no error. He told me he had run the analysis 17 times with different assumptions and gotten the same result within a small margin each time. He told me that he believed the acceleration rate was not a fixed quantity, that human technological advancement under stress was self-reinforcing, that the more they developed and deployed, the faster the subsequent development occurred because each breakthrough provided both new tools and new understanding. He said the phrase that ended my sleep for 6 months. They improve faster when they're losing than we improve when we are winning. He was not supposed to tell me that. That is not the kind of thing you say in a collective. But he told me because he was 70 years old and tired and could see what was coming and needed someone else to know. He told me, and then he retired citing health reasons, and I never spoke to him again. And then there was what I saw on Earth 7. which is the thing I have been working towards since I started this account. The thing that, more than the tactics and the technology and the morale and all of it, changed me in a way I'm still not certain how to articulate. I was on Earth 7 in Year 7, personal observation, during a phase of the ground campaign that was going badly in ways that my reports to command had been predicting for 8 months, and that command had been declining to act on for 8 months. It was going badly enough that I had received authorization to conduct a forward assessment, meaning I was close to the active engagement zone, close enough to hear it. There was a skirmish, close to our position. Not large, a patrol engagement, the kind that happened hundreds of times a day on Earth 7. One of our patrols had encountered a human resistance unit. They had engaged, and it had gone badly for both sides. When it was over, there were wounded soldiers on both sides in a neutral area between positions, in the specific geographic and situational gap where neither side had enough functional people to retrieve them quickly. We could see it from our position through monitoring equipment. What happened next is what I have spent 4 years trying to explain to people who were not there and have not managed to yet. A human soldier, female, young, based on the translation of communications we were intercepting, she had been in active combat for somewhere between 16 and 20 hours at that point, came out of the human position, toward the wounded, all of the wounded, ours and hers. She moved our wounded first. She moved them to a position where they were covered and stable and out of the way. Then she moved her own people. Then she went back for the last of ours. While she was moving our soldiers, the soldiers she had been fighting 40 seconds earlier, our monitoring equipment picked up communication from the human position asking her what she was doing. Her response, translated, "They're hurt." That was the whole answer. They're hurt. Not, "I am taking hostages." Not, "I am gaining tactical position." Not, "I have a plan." They're hurt. So she was helping them. I watched this happen. I watched a human being who had been in lethal combat for most of the day stop the war for the specific amount of time it took to make sure the people she had been trying to kill were not going to bleed to death in the dirt. Without being ordered, without tactical justification, without any apparent calculation beyond the one that said, "They are hurt, and I can help, so I am." One of the young officers on my team said, quietly, that it was a violation of the Geneva Conventions to let the enemy do that. I looked at him for a long time without speaking. He did not say anything else. We did not fire. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, and I'm going to try to be precise. I have been trained for 42 years to manage emotion in a professional context. I am good at it. It is a practice skill, and I deploy it reliably. In that moment, watching that human, I felt something that my training did not have a category for. Not admiration, not exactly. Not pity. Something older and more structural. Something that sat in the specific location in my chest where the collective's concept of moral weight lies. The concept we have for something that cannot be argued with, that exceeds the frameworks you use to evaluate it. She was right. Not tactically, not strategically, not by any metric the collective uses to evaluate action. She was just right. And the war, for me, was never the same after that. I was court-martialed in Year 8. The charges were dereliction of duty, unauthorized communication with enemy combatants, conduct unbecoming a senior officer of the collective, and something the prosecution called strategic defeatism, which is not technically a crime in the collective's military code, but which the tribunal felt covered what I had been doing in my private reports well enough to justify a formal charge. What I had been doing in my private reports was telling the truth. That is not a dramatic statement. It is a precise one. The collective's military command structure had built, over 8 years of war, an information architecture that filtered out any intelligence suggesting the war was unwinnable. Not through a conspiracy, not through deliberate malice. Through the ordinary, universal, deeply human, deeply biological, I should say, because it is apparently not uniquely human, process of institutions rejecting information that threatens their foundational assumptions. Every report I submitted that used words like unwinnable or strategic withdrawal or negotiated settlement came back stamped with notations suggesting errors in my methodology. Every report that projected the human technological advancement rate came back with requests for revised assumptions. Every report that documented human actions that did not fit the Class 3 framework was quietly archived. I kept submitting them anyway. That was the dereliction, apparently. The court-martial lasted 9 days. I was represented by a military advocate named Dreth Vora, who was, I later learned, one of the 3 or 4 most gifted legal minds in the collective's entire advocate corps, and who had specifically requested my case because she had read my reports in the archives where they had been buried and believed they were correct. She argued, among other things, that I could not be guilty of strategic defeatism for accurately assessing a strategic situation, and that archiving accurate intelligence constituted a greater dereliction than submitting it. The tribunal found me guilty on 2 of the 4 charges, dereliction and the unauthorized communication, and acquitted me on the other 2. The sentence was a reduction in rank and reassignment to a non-combat advisory position. No prison, no permanent removal from service. I was not supposed to come out of that tribunal without significant prison time. The reason I did is something I only understood much later, when I had access to communications I should not have had access to. 3 members of the tribunal voted for acquittal on all charges. They voted for acquittal because they had read my reports. The same reports that had been archived. The same reports that had been dismissed. They had read them quietly, privately, and they had found them impossible to argue with. And so they had done what the institution had trained them not to do. They had updated their thinking. It was the most quietly courageous thing I witnessed from members of my own species in the entire war, and none of them could acknowledge it publicly, and I'm not going to name them here because 2 of them are still living, and naming them would be a death sentence. I will say only, I know who they were. I will carry that. The advisory position was, in theory, a demotion. In practice, it gave me something command had been actively preventing me from doing for 3 years: direct contact with human negotiators. The first human I negotiated with directly was a woman named Commander Adissa Levi. She was not the most senior human in the room. She was one of 5 on the human side of a preliminary contact session in Year 8, the kind of session both sides called a dialogue rather than negotiation because neither side was ready to admit they were negotiating. She was there as an intelligence consultant. Her background was in xenobiology of all things, and she was specifically designated as the person responsible for understanding collective behavior patterns. She was very good at her job. Within 2 sessions, she understood things about how I thought that I had not told anyone. Not manipulative understanding. I want to be clear about that. Not profiling as a weapon. Understanding as a means of communication, as a way of ensuring that what I said and what she heard were the same thing. She was studying me so she could talk to me. There's a difference, and she knew the difference, and the fact that she knew the difference was the first genuinely hopeful thing I had experienced in 4 years of war. In the 3rd session, she said something to me that I wrote down that evening and have read many times since. We were discussing a specific engagement, a skirmish that had gone badly for both sides, heavy casualties, no tactical significance. And she said, not as a tactical point, not as a negotiating position, just as a statement of fact, we've been killing each other long enough that we don't remember what we were fighting about anymore. We're just fighting because stopping would mean admitting how many people died for nothing. And nobody on either side can do that. I looked at her for a long time. She was right. Not about the original cause. The collective's original cause was conquest, which I am not going to dignify with euphemism, but about the mechanism that was keeping the war going after it had become clear on both sides that it could not end well for either. She had named the psychological structure that was sustaining the war with a clarity that none of my reports, in 8 years of careful analysis, had managed. 10 seconds. 23 words. She was not just right. She was the first person I'd spoken to on either side who was saying the true thing out loud without a filter, without an institution editing it, without the machine of war processing it into something safer and less accurate. I said, "What do you want?" She said, "What every human wants. To stop and to not have it happen again." That was the beginning of what eventually became the armistice conversations. It took another 2 years. 2 more years of dying, 2 more years of engagements and atrocities and destruction on both sides that I will not detail because detailing them serves no one now. 2 more years because the institutional momentum of an 11-year war does not stop because 2 people in a room finally say true things to each other. It stops because the alternative becomes more obviously catastrophic than the cost of stopping. The cost of stopping was enormous. I will not pretend otherwise. The cost of not stopping would have been worse. I know this because of what our modeling showed in Year 9 when the human technological advancement had reached the level Dr. Erithfun had predicted. When our most advanced warships were being engaged by human vessels that were, in several demonstrated categories, superior. Not all categories. They still had gaps, still had weaknesses, but enough categories that the engagement outcomes had fundamentally reversed from the war's early years. We were no longer the side that usually won direct confrontations. We were the side that was hoping terrain, positioning, and tactical complexity would compensate for a growing gap in base capability. We were the Class 3 civilization now. I do not mean that as metaphor. I mean it almost literally. The collective's assessment tools, applied to the state of the conflict in Year 9, would have rated humanity somewhere between Class 7 and Class 8 by military capacity metrics. In 6 years, starting from Class 3, that advancement rate is not in our models. It does not exist as a category. Our models do not have a framework for a species that responds to war by rapidly becoming much better at war than the species that started the war with them. But the number that kept me awake, the number that, more than any engagement outcome or technological assessment, drove me to advocate as hard as I could for the armistice, was not a military number. It was a demographic one. Earthside population analysts, human ones, captured data, translated, had been tracking something they called war generation readiness. The idea was simple. How many humans currently alive had grown up entirely during the war, with the war as the defining fact of their existence, with no memory of a world where the collective was not the enemy? The answer, in Year 9, was a substantial fraction of the total human population. A substantial and growing fraction of a large and growing species, because humans, even under the conditions of extended war, had continued to have children, which is a biological fact about humans that I find, even now, somewhat stunning given what they were enduring. And those children, the ones who had grown up with the war as the normal state of reality, the ones who had never known anything else, were becoming adults. Soldiers, engineers, scientists, leaders. They were different from the generation that had started the war. Not softer, not less committed, different in a specific, terrifying way. They had no idea what peace looked like. They had no model for it. They had the war. They had the resistance culture, the improvisation, the we will survive this no matter what. And they had it at a depth that the first generation of human fighters had built through experience. These ones were born into it. It was not a response to crisis. It was identity. I wrote, in the private notes I have kept through the entire war, that I was afraid of what humanity would look like in another generation if the war continued. Not afraid of their military capacity. Afraid of one entire species that had grown up knowing nothing, but conflict would become once it had the capacity to project that conflict outward. An 11-year war with humanity was devastating. A 100-year war with humanity would produce something the galaxy had never seen. I do not know if the armistice would have happened without the Earth 7 soldier. I'm being honest about that. The political momentum existed. The military logic existed. Commander Levi and I've been building something real in those sessions. The conditions for ending the war existed independently of one moment in one ground skirmish that I watched through monitoring equipment. But I think about her. I think about her when I sit in rooms with generals and admirals who are still not sure the armistice was the right choice, who still talk about unfinished campaigns and strategic retreat in ways that make clear they have not made the same internal peace with the decision that I have. I think about what she did, the simplicity of it, the totality of it, the absolute absence of calculation, and I use it as a kind of measuring stick. I ask myself, whatever argument is being made in this room, whatever strategic position is being advocated, would that soldier recognize it as something worth doing? It is not a military calculation. It is not even a political one. But it is the clearest guide I have found. There are things I need to say about the collective before I close this account, because this confession is not complete if I treat the collective as simply a monolithic wrong thing that was opposed by a heroic right thing. That is not what happened. That has never been what happened in any war I have studied or participated in. The collective is old and vast and has done, over 8,000 years, things that range from monstrous to genuinely beneficial for the civilizations it has incorporated. Not all of those civilizations resisted. Some of them, at the end of the process, were better than they had been. The collective, whatever its failures and whatever atrocities it committed in the human wars, and there were atrocities, real ones that I documented and submitted and had archived, is not simply a machine of evil. It is a civilization, old and rigid and deeply wrong about humanity, but a civilization with everything complicated that word implies. I say this not to excuse. Nothing excuses what was done in the Beta territories. Nothing excuses total environmental denial as a policy. Nothing excuses the decisions made by commanders who chose escalation over recalibration, who chose to bury intelligence reports that told them the truth because the truth was not compatible with the story they needed to maintain. I say it because the most dangerous thing going forward is simple stories. Simple stories about humans as heroes, and the collective as villains would produce exactly the kind of universe that I was afraid of when I thought about war generation humans who had never seen peace. Simple stories produce the conditions for another war. The complicated story, the one where the collective was wrong in understandable ways, and in some of those ways wrong in the way every institution is wrong when it cannot update its assumptions, is harder to tell and harder to hear, and is the only version that is useful. The armistice holds, barely in places. There are collective factions who have not accepted it, and human factions who have not accepted it, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. There will be tests. There will be incidents. Whether those incidents become the beginning of the next war or the last friction of this one depends on choices that are being made right now, in rooms I'm no longer in, by people I can no longer influence directly. What I can do is this. I can put the true account in the world, not the collective's version, not a version that a command structure edited and archived and classified to protect an institutional narrative. The version that includes the 40 miners, the notes in the walls, the song in the settlement, the engineer and the game machine and 17 months of supply chain corruption, the interrogation, the woman on Earth 7 moving our wounded because they were hurt. All of it. Because the thing I learned in 11 years of war against humanity, the true and terrifying and ultimately clarifying thing, is that the most powerful force in any conflict is not the size of the fleet or the quality of the weapons or the sophistication of the tactics. Those matter. They matter enormously. But they're all in service of something else, something that cannot be manufactured or deployed or aimed. The thing that wins is what a species believes about itself. Humans believe they do not stop. Not as a slogan, not as propaganda, as a fact about their nature that is reinforced every time they test it and survive. Every impossible situation they came through. Every adaptation that should not have worked and worked. Every song in an occupied settlement. Every note left in a wall for someone who will never know your name. Every soldier who drags the enemy's wounded out of the dirt because they are hurt and she can help. All of that is the same thing. All of that is a species saying, this is who we are, and who we are does not break. That belief is why we lost. Not the weapons, not the tactics, the belief. And here's the part that matters most, the part that I keep in the very front of my mind when I think about what comes next. That belief, the I do not stop, the we will make it, the absolute refusal to consider the alternative as real, did not disappear with the armistice. It is still there. It is in those war generation humans who grew up with it as identity. It is in the technology that advanced 200 years in 6, because a species committed its full considerable intelligence to a problem it had to solve. It is in the communication networks that our best jamming systems cannot disrupt, and the improvised weapons that should not work, and the mirrors in the sunlight. It is in the next generation and the generation after that. The collective went to war with humanity, believing we were the terrifying ones. I want the record to be clear. We were not. We were the ones who knocked on the door and did not know what lived inside. We know now, and if there is any wisdom left in the collective's 8,000 years of history, if any of that ancient institutional knowledge includes the capacity to learn from mistake of this particular magnitude, then we understand what we must do with what we know. Not fight it, not fear it, respect it, because the terrifying truth about humans is not that they are dangerous, though they are. It is not that they adapt, though they do. It is not that they survive, though they always have. The terrifying truth is that when you come for them, when you treat them as lesser, as expendable, as a class 3 problem to be processed and absorbed, they do not just fight back. They become something larger than what they were. Something that the threat shaped and the resistance forged and the suffering refined. Something that carries in the bone and in the culture and in the songs they sing quietly in occupied territories, every version of themselves that survived everything that tried to end them. You do not fight that and win. You cannot win against a species that gets up every time. The only move that produces a future anyone survives, is to stop trying to put them down. I filed that report in year 8. They made me a war criminal for it. They will make me a war criminal again for this. Some things are worth it. My name is Vorith Sel. I am the last surviving commander of the 7th Collective Armada. I have served in 12 wars. I have won 11 of them. The one I lost was the one I was right about from the start. Remember the 40 miners. Remember the songs. Remember the woman in the mud. That is the whole war. Everything else is just the numbers.